we're going to start our closing keynote. And our keynote speaker this afternoon is Ian Cullwick, a partner in the Ottawa office of Deloitte Consulting, and actually he's the head for all of Canada of the public sector leadership practice. So we have a real expert here. And he is also a professor at Carleton University, and he teaches on organizational development and governance, a real expert. So he's going to talk to us this afternoon about strategic challenges in uncertain times. Let's give a warm welcome to Ian.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. Nice to see a few familiar faces in the audience. I'd like to take the next 20 to 25 minutes and essentially give you a big picture perspective on the one hand. At least that's what I was asked to do, is to give you the big picture perspective on the one hand, but to hopefully give you some very specific insights in terms of what I'm seeing and what my practice is seeing in terms of multi-jurisdictional public sector human resources and leadership practices with a focus on strategic human resources. And one of the things I hope to do is dispel some of the myths and realities that are in the marketplace. And I'm just going to flip over here. And the way I'd like to approach this is I think it is really useful to look back, right back to 2002. Because quite frankly, from my perspective, we are where we are today because of what's evolved over two major time phases since 2002. In other words, the strategic issues, the priorities that I believe need to be acted on by you as public sector leaders, both as business and program leaders as well as human resources leaders, tie into some major events that have happened over the last 6-7 years. And so that's how I'm going to attack this. So let's go to sort of 2002, 2007. The good times, okay? These were really the good times. To take you back, and for, I think, we've got a mix of baby boomers in the audience and perhaps some that are a little younger than the baby boom. If you go back to 2001, the dot-com crash happened. And for those of us in my business, I remember from about 1999 to sort of 2001, and it was just crazy, helping a number, and being based in Ottawa, helping a number of startup high-tech companies, give them advice as to whether, in fact, they should be giving the 21-year-old college dropout the $50,000 signing bonus, the $50,000 stock options, and a salary of about $125,000 so that they can have that expertise in their business to write code to bring the whole system down. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating. That was what was going on. And of course, all of that came to a halt in 2001. There was a bit of a recession. The high-tech sector crashed, and everything had to recalibrate. And many of those technology specialists, guess where they ended up? Broad public sector, because there was a huge demand for them. The only silver lining was, well, there were two silver linings. Many of them were now unemployed, and quite frankly, a good base salary of $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, and good pension and benefits and job security were way better than 50,000 under-the-water stock options. So that was the start, 2002. The start of an economic boom in the real estate sector, the finance sector, the technology sector was resurging, and the oil and gas boom, and we all saw it. The big legacy of that, of course, was the price of oil and what that did to Western Canada, and specifically Alberta, and for any one of us living across this country that wanted to find a plumber, an electrician, you name it, skilled trades, semi-skilled trades, we couldn't get them. And the test for me was when the Tim Hortons in Fort McMurray had a starting wage rate of $35 an hour for a counter person. That tells you the labor market is overheated. Then we had, and that manifested itself, of course, into what I would argue, and this goes to some myth versus reality, media-driven talent shortages. Business Week, Fortune magazine, Canadian Business, Canadian government executive, you name it. It was all about, quote unquote, talent management shortages and labor shortages. But you know what? Even in 03, 04, 05, right through to 07, I would argue, yeah, there were some specific talent and labor shortages, typically in skilled trades, but it was not every occupation. It was not every industry. The average age in the hospitality sector is about 31. Oddly enough, up until about sort of 06 and 07, the average age in the financial services sector was about early to mid-30s. The sectors, of course, that had the challenge were utilities and core public sector. But it was not every industry, and even for those industries that had challenges, it was only specific skill sets within those industries, within those organizations. The media blew this, with total exaggeration. You lived it, we lived it. Firms like us, of course, capitalized on some of that in terms of helping with some particular strategies to deal with it. But that was a common theme. By the way, I'll talk in a minute about talent management and how it is also a misconstrued, trendy phrase that, quite frankly, a lot of people, sorry, I was just getting a fruit fly out of the way here. A lot of people will look at you cross-eyed and say, talent management. What does that really mean? I mean, for any one of you who works in the sort of the HR organizational area, or if you're in a program leadership role, and somebody talks to you about the phrase talent management, more often than not, you get this quizzical look saying, okay, what are you really talking about? But I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But a common headline from 2002, certainly through 07, before the economic recession hit, guess what? An aging population. Despite all these economic, social, and political trends and events that we all lived, we all continued to get older. And of course, this is quite profound, where the implications of this are emerging for the public sector. So the HR priorities, the human resources and leadership priorities, of course, managing those skill shortages where they were real. And again, the media, and I would argue other stakeholders, blew this out of proportion. For some of you, it was quite real. One of the roles that I had a pleasure to be in for about 2 years that came to an end in early 09, I was an advisor to the Canadian Nuclear Association on the issue of talent management and labor shortages. Nuclear engineers don't grow on trees. They're really hard to find. That is an example of a critical workforce segment or job where there's significant concern. I mean, if you look at all the utilities across the country, look at Quebec Hydro of late, they're going to buy New Brunswick Power. They don't have enough nuclear engineers. They're going to get Point Lepreau, which is the nuclear station, of course, in New Brunswick, but they're not going to get enough. There just aren't not enough nuclear engineers. And they all have defined benefit pension programs. Average age of nuclear engineers is about 53. So, you can do the math. You know where this is going. That's an example of where it's real. Many other cases, it was not real. And there was almost chaos and nervousness because of it. So those other priorities, this concept of talent management, what I just talked about. Again, I can go into meetings with clients and they will bring it up or I'll bring it up, and you'll get this quizzical look. Well, gee, what do you really mean by talent management? And essentially what talent management is almost the branding phrase that came out of this particular period of time. In terms, it was the concept, I mean, in fact, it was competitors of ours, McKinsey, I suspect everybody heard of it was a great article called The War for Talent. The thesis, of course, was key employees, high-performance employees in key jobs will have a disproportionate positive impact on your business. I subscribe to that, by the way. Our firm, we have a series of offerings in this area. We coined the phrase critical workforce segments. So for that 5-year run, literally up till about 18 months ago, firms like McKinsey and Deloitte were talking about talent management, but with a focus on what are you doing to design and calibrate your HR policies and practices and your management practices around, quote unquote, critical workforce segments. In other words, those jobs with those people that represent the core essence of what you are about and who essentially represent the value for your mandate. That's really what it was about. Here's what's happened, though. I would say, and this is a rhetorical philosophical question for you. I can tell you, I would say with at least 50% of our clients where we're brought in to help with HR strategy and talent management strategy, here's the issue. I would say 50% of them buy into the notion that HR strategy, in other words, policies, programs, and activities, should first and foremost be calibrated against the needs of those critical workforce jobs and those high performers that are in those jobs. But here's the new trend. And it's really interesting, and it's more common in the public sector. And it's strategic and it's philosophical. The other 50% of clients are saying, you know what? I believe the economic theory of what you're saying, but in terms of our values and our principles, we're not going to try to identify critical workforce segments because all our jobs are important. From the point of view of values and principles around equity and fairness and looking at the broad organization. In fact, you know, this gentleman sitting over to my right, I picked up some of that from your presentation just earlier. The fact is, the other 50% of organizations are saying, no, we're going to take a holistic perspective on this whole thing. Yes, we need good workforce profile data so that we can segment and slice and dice our different workforce segments by age, by job, by classification level, et cetera, but our philosophy is going to be equitable, and we're going to look at all employees, the general needs of the workforce, and we're not going to calibrate our programs to the specific needs of particular jobs or segments. By the way, the other part of that is, any time that we've sat down with a client in a workshop to try and identify what those critical workforce segments are, you know, you as business leaders invariably have a really tough time picking the 2 or 3 out of the 45. You know, invariably it's, you know what, I think at 35, we're 35 or 40. In other words, it's really tough to make those choices. And then you've got the values and the principles that get in the way. So this is an emerging trend that on the one hand is good, but it may make the process of recasting your policies and programs for the future. Having said that, guess what? Guess what unions do when they sit down to collective bargain? Of course, they're democratic institutions, and they're going to look at the majority interests of their employees in those critical workforce segments. So the irony here is many public sector employers don't want to go there for a whole bunch of reasons, but unions, when they sit down to prepare and then conduct collective bargaining, do. So keep that in mind. Compensation was a huge challenge for that 5-year window, largely because of everything we saw and how it manifested itself in the largeness and the excessiveness of typically publicly traded company compensation, especially in the U.S. It got out of hand. I would argue that, you know, pay for performance and value creation absolutely makes sense, but stock options are generally the culprit. Things like restricted stock, deferred stock, those are great vehicles to build long-term connections and engagement, but stock options are too easy. And of course, for that period of time, the tide rose up. Our managing partner of Deloitte has a great saying, when the tide's up, you don't see a lot of rocks. You know, good and bad managers can rise with the tide. When the tide's down, you see a lot of rocks. You see the good and the bad, and there's transparency of the bad. And stock options were, as we all know, not necessarily the optimal vehicle. Compensation challenges were real, and they manifested themselves in 07 and 08. And we're seeing an impact on the public sector because of it. So, for example, if you're not aware of this, the G20 countries have gotten together over the last 6 months, and they have developed 9 principles and guidelines for effective executive compensation for the private sector. Those 9 guidelines that will essentially represent guidelines for the Western world, they will become the standards for Crown corporations and agencies, and I would argue in about 2 to 3 years' time, the public sector as well. It will become a common framework for all of us in terms of good compensation governance. So, what you may want to do, go to the OSFI website if you want to get your hands on those 9 guidelines, because Julie Dixon, who of course is the Superintendent of Financial Institutions for Canada, the Superintendent for Canada, she's one of the participants on that task force that again consists of the G20 nations. So that's how, that's going to have an impact on us. Workforce profiling. In fact, I see some of my former clients in this room, to their credit, in sort of 01, 02, saw this coming because of the economic climate and the tide, and first and foremost wanted to make sure that good basic workforce profiles existed. And this may sound, like a no-brainer to you, but I guarantee you, most organizations, especially if you're with a large employer, getting your hands on good, basic, up-to-date workforce profiles, it's almost impossible to do. The City of Ottawa made the headlines about a year ago because the mayor wanted to know how many full-time and part-time employees there were amongst the 15,000 employees at the City of Ottawa. They use SAP. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. They couldn't get an accurate profile, despite the fact they use a vehicle like SAP. SAP is another issue. Great tool, it's how it's used. So these are the emerging and key HR priorities through that 5-year window. And then there were some change events that, everybody's aware of. In 07, 08, of course, we had the start of the decline and fall of Lehman Brothers, Morgan Stanley. It was almost like another wave of Enron and WorldCom back in 2000, 2001. And then, of course, we had the Gomery Commission here in Canada. It was all about accountability. And then federally, we had the Accountability Act put into place. To the credit of the Conservatives, they were focused when they won that first election a few years ago, and the Accountability Act was one of their 5 points of priority. And they got it put in place. That Accountability Act changed the tone, at least federally, in terms of the tone and approach that federal leaders had to bring to their work. And quite frankly, I would argue, and I'm going to flip over to this in a minute, that the Accountability Act, because of the new pressures and the fact that the concept of accountability was now first and foremost in everybody's face, and knowing that your Prime Minister and your Privy Council office and your ministers and your deputy ministers had to toe that particular tone, that started to change the culture. Then the recession kicked in. So now we have this tone of accountability, a declining economy, high unemployment. So guess what? Was there a talent management shortage anymore? Not a chance. I remember reading an article in the New York Times, and it was about unemployment in the New York financial services industry and in California. 100,000 unemployment financial specialists, investment brokers, investment bankers, accountants in the U.S., just in the states of New York and California. 100,000 unemployed. That all started to happen in 07 and 08. The media of talent management and labor shortages disappeared. Oil starts to plummet. There's no more talent shortage in Alberta. Tim Hortons in Fort McMurray, they're back to sort of $7.50 an hour, not $35 an hour. And then the excessive executive compensation, of course, continued because most of those publicly traded big companies like Merrill Lynch, long-term incentive programs typically have a 3 to 5 year timeline, and value was created, and executives started to cash in on those options because they saw the curve. They saw the stock prices starting to come down. PE multiples were going down. So executives started to cash out. The media picked up on it, and we have an issue. Low external turnover. That number of 4.5%, so the turnover in the federal public sector in fiscal year 07-08 and 08-09, and of course that fiscal year came to an end March 31st of this past year, 4.5%. So again, back to the media hype. Turnover's high, we can't find people, retiring baby boomers are going to be a catastrophic event for us. But the reality was, for the last 2 years in a row, at least federally, it's been 4.5%. Most employers would love that. In fact, most employers in the private sector and the parapublic sector would say, gee, it's not high enough. It's not high enough. By the way, of that 4.5%, 1% of the 4.5 is voluntary external turnover. The other 3.5% is fully pensioned, vested, time to retire. So from a business point of view, politicians and executive leadership are saying, there really is not an issue here. I'll tell you where there is an issue, and I suspect you can all relate to it. It's the internal executive turnover. 20 to 25% federally are turning over internally. And good talent, of course, has, the high performers in the public sector have lots of opportunity in this day and age. And the challenge is, I think the Public Policy Forum actually did a study on this. The average tenure of an EX resource federally was something like no more than 2 years. I mean, just think of that, no more than 2 years. I mean, that has a major negative impact on the long-term implementation and accountability of long-term initiatives and products and projects. But the population's still aging, so you can pick up a theme where I'm going on this. So suddenly we have this economy, we have these events that have essentially changed the human resources agenda. No more skill shortages, lots of people wanting to come here. Compensation challenges are really diminishing as that tide goes down. It's a classic Phillips curve, high unemployment, lower compensation. Accountability now is the norm. The Federal Accountability Act, at least federally, is in place. It's changing the tone. Having said that, to the credit of people like Kevin Lynch, who just retired, about 2 years ago, he had foresight because he knew that the economy, of course, is going to change. Likely in 2010, we're going to see it. By the way, my view and our insights at Deloitte is that the private sector recession is coming to an end right now. The public sector recession is still going on, obviously because of stimulus spending, high deficits, and significant pressures on you to find cost savings and manage more efficient budgets. So accountability is out there. And by the way, federally, this is manifesting itself into things like A-based reviews, mandatory strategic reviews for each and every department, crown, and agency every 4 years. In other words, those strat reviews, those strategic reviews, they exist to identify redundant or low value-added programs, and then the plan is identify them, and then how are you going to get out of them to free up those resources to put them where they're really needed. That's the federal agenda right now, and that's real. One of my clients is Foreign Affairs, and it is remarkable how much pressure they are under, despite the fact they need to beef up their infrastructure across 174 missions around the world. They're under this pressure with a gun to their head to reduce their operational spend by 7 to 10%. I mean, that's pretty significant. Those may sound like simple numbers. That is really significant. So the HR priorities over the last 18 to 24 months, including the time we're in right now, accountability is there. Compensation governance is becoming really key. It's a space that I do a lot of work in, especially with Crown corporations. And I can tell you the tone across Crowns across this country, whether it's federal or provincial, is even if there is a market gap, and I've got one jurisdiction I do quite a bit of work with, even where there was a measurable conservative gap of about 10% relative to the comparable private sector, the right decision was made to not make any market adjustments in 2009. For all those obvious, intuitive reasons that hopefully everybody can relate to. It just politically wasn't the right thing to do, small p and big P. But compensation governance has now become a big issue in the private sector. Back to my G29 principles, that will impact the public sector. It's starting to impact the parapublic sector. I know of a couple of Crown corporations right now, both federally and provincially, that are starting to adopt those principles because they want to be ready, because they know that when they sit down with their HR committee of the board or the board, the question's going to come up. So you might as well beat them to it as opposed to reacting to the direction from the board. Efficiency and measurement, back to that accountability theme. You know, what's the HR priority right now? It really is, in this current day and age, a huge focus on efficiency, simplifying processes and practices. You know, it's interesting, if I stand back, and I know some of my clients in the room can relate to this, 10 years ago, I mean, take yourself back 10 years ago, 1999, 2000, everybody was talking about the need to make HR strategic. We need to be more advisory and strategic. Nobody was really concerned about operations and stewardship. Guess what? That pendulum has swung way over to the other side. And the focus in this day and age right now is stewardship around good operational processes. Using your technology and systems as best you can. Drive your costs down. That's really what's happened. So really it's about the balance between being advisory and strategic and efficient and cost-effective around your processes and measurement. I mean, there's huge pressure in this day and age now on finance, HR, IT, and facilities to measure the value added, measure the cost benefit, and guess what? If it's not optimal, to make it optimal. So this theme of accountability, measurement, and efficiency, that really is the theme right now. Talent management and labor shortages and workforce planning really aren't on the radar screen for most organizations. To their risk, though. There's a risk, and you likely know where I'm going to go with this. Change events. So a big change event federally, and I know to some extent with some provinces, has been the fact that, and I'm looking at the bottom of this slide. So while I've talked about compensation governance, guess where the focus has been? Federally, the federal public sector has done a fantastic job around financial governance. It's called the Cfo Framework. And there's been a huge focus for the last 2 years to implement, I mean, this may sound pretty basic to you, a common financial governance framework. Processes, programs, policies, organizational models, having a chief financial officer, requiring deputy ministers to sign off on financial statements, pretty basic practices that, of course, are common in the private sector, especially for publicly traded private sector entities, where you've got these financial regulations and requirements to sign off on. So over the last 2 years, financial governance has occurred, and it's working. It's not quite there yet, but it's working. Also audit. Again, federally, every federal government department now is required to have a DAC, a DAC, a Departmental Audit Committee. So the internal audit community has gotten its act together. By the way, none of this would have happened, of course, without absolute executive leadership support, prompting, and direction. And you know what? The same thing is happening in the area of procurement. I mean, firms like us that work in the private sector can't stand it. I mean, public sector procurement practices are absolutely, they're extremely tough and difficult. But you know what? It's likely the right thing to do. So the irony here is we've got finance, internal audit, and procurement that are getting their internal governance act together. This has not happened in the area of HR. This is not on the HR agenda. Some public sector leaders are starting to look at it. I know federally this is on the agenda item for a couple of new central agency deputy ministers, but it has not happened yet because the focus for the last 2 years, quite frankly, has been about the money. It's been about financial capability, and that's what that theme demonstrates. The other piece that came into place federally is called the ERA, and I'm not talking about earned run average in baseball. The Expenditure Restraint Act came into place this past summer, and essentially it is frozen, and it dictates for the federal jurisdiction economic adjustments of about 1.5% this year and 1.5% next year. But more importantly, freezing the ability of employers, even if you have a legitimate business case, to make economic adjustments to particular job classes or sit down and have collective bargaining discussions to address anomalies. It's frozen that. I mean, I've read this act. In fact, I was in a client meeting last week where there's a very legitimate issue, but financially it can't be dealt with because of the Expenditure Restraint Act, which expires, by the way, March 31st, 2011. March 31st, 2011, so 18 months from now. So this is a backdrop, and it's significantly influenced, I would argue, the strategic HR agenda. Okay, looking at workforce profiles, critical workforce segments, workforce planning, HR strategy. Those things have essentially been pushed onto the back burner so that this could be the focus. And the challenge is, again, what's the headline here? The baby boomers are continuing to get older. We're getting closer. This is the first quarter, so from starting in September, that I have truly seen a material number of my clientele and relationships actually retiring, whether it's in Newfoundland, federally, or in Saskatchewan. It's now starting to happen. So this is a bit of a segue to, if I go to the next slide. So what do we see as the priorities? What are the agenda items? And where should the focus be? Because the pending wave of retirements for public sector baby boomers, it's real. It's been pushed to the back burner, and now it's going to manifest itself. And if there's one sort of pearl of wisdom or thesis that I can leave you with this afternoon, it's that if you're not dealing with this workforce planning issue, and if you don't have good workforce planning data, you better get your act together, because those are the key building blocks for how you're going to need to manage the pending waves of retirements that are going to now start washing up on the beach. So headlines: stimulus spending and public sector debt. Are you going to have a good business case to invest in workforce planning or new technology or business intelligence tools to develop an up-to-date profile of your workforce? It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for you if you happen to be an HR executive or, quite frankly, a deputy minister or program ADM, to get the funding to do those kind of things, or to hire external resources like us to help you. The money's going to be tight. The focus is productivity and efficiency. It really is, because the focus right now is program delivery, results for Canadians, getting the programs out, getting the money out to the marketplace. That's where the focus is. The first wave of retirements. The big impact, the big risk here from my point of view is that leadership cadre. I've seen this happen. I've seen 5 instances in about the last month where people have actually retired. One example, Becky Room was the Deputy Minister and Chief HR Officer for the province of Newfoundland. An amazing lady. She retired last Friday. They can't find somebody internally to fill her post. So the poor Deputy Minister of Finance / Deputy Minister of Treasury Board is now the Deputy Minister of the Public Service Commission. That's a huge mandate, because they can't find somebody with the skill sets to deal with this emerging agenda. Aging population, emerging skill. So, my view is, we're not going to see it in the short term, because, again, go back to that 4.5% turnover. I mean, if you're an operational leader in the public sector right now, 4.5%, that's not a challenge. I mean, that really is not a challenge, especially if you can bring back some of those retired people in those key skill sets on some sort of retainer. This is not an issue. But you know what? It's going to start becoming a huge issue, I would argue, in the latter half of 2010, and then for the next 5 to 7 years, assuming the economy pulls out and pulls up. The retirements are going to happen, especially for those that enjoy defined benefit pension programs. Oil and gas will start to become key. I mean, if you look at the price of gas right now, it's dirt cheap. So it's got nowhere to go but up. So you know what? Alberta's going to happen again. The oil sands are going to happen again. Jeff Rubin, who's ex-CIBC, may be right. Oil may go to, who knows if it's going to go to $200 a barrel, but it's going to go up. Alberta's going to happen again. All those skilled trades are going to go back out west. Newfoundland is starting to come online with its programs. Quebec Hydro is going online with major expansions. So skilled trades, public sector labor deficiencies, it's going to come back. And as soon as the economy heats up, latter half of 2010, 2011, you know what? It may not be $35 an hour at Tim Hortons in Fort McMurray, but it's likely going to be $25. It's going to come back. Only this time, instead of talking about how we need to plan for it, we're going to be in the middle of it because it's going to hit because of the front end of those baby boomers who can move out and the leadership vacuum in the public sector. So, where does this take us? And, again, this is just sort of my perspective. Pension and talent management. Pension management is huge for all the reasons, everything that you're reading. I suspect some of you are living this. There are, I know of so many public sector entities, whether it's agencies, crowns, or departments, that are looking at going to defined contribution programs. Saskatchewan went down this path a few years ago. The era of the defined benefit pension program, it's unfortunately going to come to an end. It's going, even for the public sector. So if you're in that space right now, enjoy it, protect it, because it's going to come to an end. Not entirely, but it will get replaced. Talent management, back to that odd, quizzical statement. Really what this comes down to is the need, there is going to be a need to start workforce planning. And how do you workforce plan? You better know what your workforce looks like. The quantitative and the qualitative. Because you're going to have to workforce plan, you're going to have to succession plan. That's going to have to happen. And if you're not doing that now, and by the way, right now, probably one of the best labor markets to hire that all of us in this room will probably see for the next 10 to 15 years. The talent out there right now is incredible. It's a buyer's market. 2 years ago, it was a seller's market. Now it's a buyer's market. We just finished our university recruitment campaign, and the quality of talent is incredible. It's the best I've seen in about 5 years. So you want to be buying now. You want to be putting in workforce planning processes and succession planning processes to either internally develop and or externally recruit, because this is going to be real. And I don't want to over-dramatize it, but in about 6 to 12 months, we're really going to feel it. If you happen to be in your 30s, you're probably in the sweetest generational segment that you could ever imagine, because the world's your oyster. The number of vertical career opportunities that you're going to see will be incredible. The risk, of course, is the Peter principle. People will move up too quickly. But if you're in your 30s and you're in the system, congratulations, because you've got an amazing career ahead of you. Service delivery efficiency is becoming really key. This comes down to the business model of HR management. And I'm going to touch on more on that in a minute, because there's a major implication for those of you that are operational managers and employees, and governance. Change events, everything I'm hearing through just a broader network in Ottawa is we will have a federal government election likely in May or June. It won't be any later than the end of June. And by the way, it won't be before May 31st. And we heard this, I can share this with you because I was in an event with Tom Clark, the guy on TV, with CTV. His insight is that because so many NDP and Liberal MPs stand to get fully vested pensions by March 31st, they're not going to run the risk of an election now and lose their seats, so they lose their pensions. So nothing's going to happen until April 1st. So you know what? Between April 1st and June, we're going to have an election. Who knows what the implication of that's going to be for all of us in the agenda? Afghanistan. That's a big uncertainty. The economy, deficits, stimulus spending. So there are a lot of uncertainties that we're coming into for 2010. But the one certainty we all have is the baby boom generation is continuing to get older, and there's going to be we're going to see the start of a massive wave of retirements. So I'd just like to finish by going to the last slide here. and really, the triangle, I've in a sense covered that off. What I just want to spend a few minutes on are the implications. And again, this is just my perspective, and Whether you agree or disagree, I just want to try and give you some insights that you can mull over. The impact of this agenda on line managers and employees. And here's what's happening. When it comes to increased accountability for people results in HR, 10 years ago, the rule of thumb was, sorry, this fruit fly is back again. The rule of thumb was, gee, let's push as much as we can to the line managers and employees. Let's move to web-based HR systems and portals. Let's push as much as we can to employees and line managers, because you know what? Line managers need to be accountable for people, finance, and their programs. Now I would argue line managers and operational ADMs and DGs, rightly so, are saying, you know what, look, you're expecting a lot out of me right now, given this economy, given what our citizens expect in terms of program effectiveness. Make my corporate services world as simple as you can. So I probably should have had the word simplicity up there. So the priority for corporate services, including HR, is try to unencumber your line management and operational staff as much as you can. Make their world as simple as possible. And what that means is good, efficient HR systems and practices and processes with great advisory support and behind the scenes, with joint accountabilities. That's really what this is about. Because if you put too much of the corporate services agenda on your line managers, back to some of the slides that you shared with us earlier, the stress levels are going to be incredible. The absenteeism levels are going to be incredible. The pressures are doing nothing but going up. So please be cautious of the implications of this whole agenda on your line managers and employees. You better be careful for what you hope for. Program delivery, that's where the focus is. It's making sure that your programs are as efficient and effective as you can. Implications for boards of directors and governors of your respective businesses wherever you come from. Governance is a hot topic right now. It's been a hot topic for 3 to 5 years because of the excesses that we've seen in the private sector, unfortunately, and the Accountability Act in the public sector. It's not going to go away. Governance is really big. Internal governance in terms of process, decision rights, delegated authorities, and how all of those practices work. This is going to do nothing but get bigger. The HR mandate and focus. So again, I would argue that the HR agenda, and many of you have influence over that, has to be focused on doing the basics really well. But at the same time, you've got to be you've got to be balancing and looking at your workforce profile. What does it look like? So get the facts. Do you have the facts? Do you have the systems and the business intelligence processes that can give you meaningful, relevant, up-to-date profiles of what your workforce looks like or what a particular segment looks like, so that you know how you're going to deal with these increasing number of internal vacancies and external turnover due to retirements. HR value added. There's a real push right now, as there is, by the way, with procurement and information technology, to drive value added. Can you standardize? Can you go to economies of scale and centralize? Can you leverage the internet? Can you go with web-based solutions that allow you to simplify the efficiency and the economy of your processes so that you can free up resources to provide the strategic value added? That really is the challenge here. And quite frankly, my last comment, and this is to state the obvious, none of this is going to happen, balancing the strategy, so the analytics, the planning, and the decision-making on the wave of retirements and succession planning and workforce planning and hiring, if you don't have your basics in place. And to manage that balance and to deal with this agenda, quite frankly, it's going to be all about leadership. Kevin Lynch and his replacement, Wayne Waters, fortunately, federally, that agenda item is on their table, on their plate, and they're not going to let go of it. There are CEOs of crowns and agencies that get this. The challenge is, how do you balance it all within the HR agenda, within the corporate services agenda, and then, of course, with the broader operational mandate that, of course, deputy ministers and ADMs have. So that essentially is the perspective that I wanted to share. Gabe, I suspect we're probably out of time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a privilege.